Chapter 28. Grdnov. A pall of dust hung over Grdnov. The town was choked with traffic of every sort. The depot, a large, dome-shaped structure, was in chaos. Soldiers and civilians were mixed together, cursing and yelling in anger, some weeping bitterly. A train was pulling out, with soldiers crowding every car, every compartment, and clinging to the sides like leeches. "When is the next train?" The question was being asked by countless voices in several languages over and over, so many times it began to sound like a chant. We would not wait for a train, Tamara and I decided. As did many others, we continued on through town, through streets teeming with people and vehicles, all moving in the same direction. Over the shuffle of feet and other noises came the rumble of a battle being fought somewhere to the north. "Get out of the way or I'll shoot every one of you!" People stood back as a German officer yelled and bullied his way through the crowd, waving a machine pistol. In his wake, from a heavy cart, came stretcher-bearers with wounded soldiers. They made their way through the main door of what appeared to be a government building. From within came the cries of men in pain. "We need doctors!" shouted the officer. He had entered the building only to reappear momentarily. He again waved his machine pistol and shouted to the crowd, "We need help, please! Können Sie uns bitte helfen?" A few people glanced his way, then hurried on. "Any kind of help! My men are dying!" Tamara and I exchanged glances. She did not understand the officer's words, but it was obvious what he was asking. She grimaced as a horribly burned young soldier was trundled inside, then looked at me and nodded. I touched the officer's sleeve. "We can help," I told him. "We were in a medical unit. We are not doctors, but we can be of use." For a moment the officer seemed confused, as though he had not understood what he said. Then his hard features softened. "Thank you." Startling me, he put an arm around my soldiers. "And you tell them that Captain Gebhardt said you are to be fed." "Thank you, sir," I said, and then Tamara and I made our way inside. We were in a triage area where doctors were sorting out the wounded, deciding who could be saved and who could not, and who should be treated first. Much of the large room was filled with men on stretchers. Other wounded sat on the floor, mostly along the walls and aisles. Small, naked light bulbs hung from the ceiling over tables where doctors were operating. "Why are you two just standing there? Get to work!" A medic wearing rubber gloves, boots, and blood-smeared rubber apron was glowering at us. Furious, he stormed off, then returned and shoved gloves and smocks into our hands. We put them on over our clothes. Then we plunged into the work, washing and bandaging wounds, applying pressure bandages and tourniquets, splinting broken arms and legs. We worked non-stop until about 4:30, when food was brought in for the medics and orderlies. We were wolfing down potato soup and bread when I noticed a familiar figure striding toward us, Captain Gebhardt. "Ah, my two volunteers!" he exclaimed in German, standing over us where we sat on the floor with our soup and bread. I found myself looking at his knee-length black boots, then up at him in his soiled gray uniform and visored cap with its Edelweiss insignia. My chest tightened with fear. In reality, I was a deserter, Tamara, a Russian, the enemy. For these reasons, both of us could be taken out and shot. But Gebhardt was smiling benevolently. "I thank you again for helping." "We're glad to do it, sir." "Is the food at least edible?" He was looking at Tamara, asking her the question, in German. She smiled at him, trying to conceal her lack of understanding. She speaks only Slovak," I blurted, hoping the lie sounded convincing. Tamara was a Czech volunteer with our unit. Gebhardt was not listening, or even looking at us. He was gazing around at the sea of wounded men and boys. A change had come over him. He seemed lost in thought, and had a strange look in his eyes. How did this happen? There was anger and great sadness in his voice. "The finest army in the world reduced to this! And we've lost the war! How could we have lost?" "I do not know, Captain." He slammed a fist into his hand. "How?" Fury in his eyes, shaking his head. he wandered off. Gebhardt was half out of his mind, I decided, just as Mr. Long Underwear and the other German soldiers in the bunker so many months before had been. The war had driven them crazy with rage, bitterness, and confusion. The Germans, especially the veteran soldiers, had been certain they would conquer the world. They'd been led to believe, as I had, that nothing else was possible. But then the impossible had happened. They were losing, being driven back on all fronts. The British and Americans were attacking them from the west, the Russians coming at them from the east, slaughtering them and driving them back to Germany. Across the way, Captain Gebhardt was going from one wounded soldier to the next, patting each on the back and otherwise offering up encouragement. Most of the soldiers were very young. Words spoken long ago came to mind. All the men are dead. Now they are sending us boys. In the west, an oversized orange sun was dying as two other boys and I began digging in a sandy lot behind the government building. We were on burial detail. The bodies were brought out in children's wagons. We quickly dug shallow graves in the soft, almost sandy soil, then filled them in, leaving mounds. To the north and east of Grdnov, heavy fighting was going on. Headed into battle, troops of young German soldiers tramped past across the lot where we were working. I suddenly found myself staring. One of the leaders had a face that had been rendered easily recognizable by disfigurement. Dobermann. As he trudged past, leading his troops like a teacher leading his students, Dobermann's eyes met mine. I do not know if he recognized me or not. He seemed to, but he just kept going. Suddenly I thought of a friend. "Jacob!" I yelled. My yell caused several heads to turn my way briefly, but then they looked forward and continued on. One face kept looking back over a shoulder at me. There seemed to be a strange, enigmatic smile on the ruined, twisted mouth. A train would be arriving soon. Word spread quickly through the makeshift hospital. Almost immediately we began transporting the patients to the domed depot, which was about 100 meters distant and on the same side of the street. Stretchers, wheelchairs, gurneys, and carts, we used whatever was on hand to get the wounded to the train station. There we waited. Day turned to night. Civilians, mostly Czechs and Ukrainians, milled about on the platform outside the depot, anxiously gazing down at the tracks, hoping at any moment to see the train. The tracks remained empty. From the north came the throaty grumble of battle. By midnight, the train had still not arrived. A misty rain began to fall. A few grimy, sopping wet German soldiers straggled into the depot, directly from the front lines, it seemed. Their bodies stank. They were hollow-eyed, ragged, and radiated blood and death and defeat. They began arriving in ever-increasing numbers. The hammering of automatic weapons fire erupted somewhere to the outskirts of Grdnov, and there was the occasional boom of artillery being fired from within the town toward the advancing enemy. Now and then, to the northwest, came popping noises, followed by whooshing hisses as parachute flares rose diagonally into the sky, paused for a moment, then slowly fluttered earthward, swinging like pendulums, lighting up the darkness with rocking white light. The din of battle grew closer. Over it came another sound, the mournful shriek of a whistle. The sound was unmistakable. A train came into view, backing into the terminal. Crewmen, hanging from steel ladders on the cars, carried lanterns which cast yellow shadows all around. On top of each car were German guards with automatic weapons. Built for transporting cattle and other livestock, the sides of most of the cars were of wooden slats set far apart. Wind and rain could stream in. The trip west would be a cold one. We didn't care. All we wanted to do was to get out of there before the fighting engulfed the town. The depot came alive with activity. All medical personnel, including Tamara and I, went to work getting the wounded aboard. To the horror of the mass of civilians, German soldiers began herding them back away from the train. They're just going to leave us, a gap-toothed peasant woman cried shrilly. An angry murmuring erupted from the crowd, and the people began pressing forward against the soldiers. A single gunshot was fired into the air, silencing the crowd. "There will be room for everyone," said a German lieutenant in a loud but calm voice, a Luger pistol in his hand. "Be calm. You will be boarding soon. But as I'm sure you can understand, the wounded must go first." The crowd on the depot platform relaxed. They had the reassurance they needed. From a few of them came words to the effect that they could see the logic and fairness of what the officer had told them. Surely the wounded had to be taken care of first. Some sounded ashamed of themselves for having been so selfish and untrusting. We put most of the wounded on straw mattresses in the cars. Some of the soldiers arriving from the front helped us with the patients. However, most just climbed into the cars and found a comfortable place for themselves. Many immediately fell asleep. The rest sat staring into space, motionless as statues. Among the latter was a boy whose left leg was badly cut and who suddenly went into convulsions. Tamara and I crawled into the car to try to help the doctors there. The convulsions ceased. The boy lost consciousness. By fluttering light in the car, I sprinkled sulfa powder on the wound, then watched as Tamara and the doctor stitched up the boy's flayed leg. I heard a commotion outside on the depot platform. More soldiers climbed into our car and into cars all up and down the line. At the same time, I heard the chug of the locomotive. The train rocked forward. "They are going to leave them," I muttered aloud. From outside, a German soldier rolled the heavy door of our car closed with a bang. Through the slatted sides of the car, I could see the civilians on the depot platform and caught a glimpse of more soldiers scrambling into cars. Other soldiers with fixed bayonets were herding the civilians back away from the train as they yelled and begged to be let on board. "You can't do this," they began to press forward. "You're leaving us to die, you lying pigs." Overhead, from the roofs of the train cars, there were bursts of automatic weapons fire over the civilians' heads. Depot windows shattered, and dusty plumes of stucco popped from walls. In a panic, the crowd retreated into the terminal building. As they did, the remaining soldiers raced for the train and jumped aboard. Slowly it gathered momentum, leaving the depot and the civilians behind. Tamara and I looked at each other. Both of us were sickened by what had just happened. But there was nothing we could say, nothing we could do. "Give me a hand." We picked our way through the car to where the doctor was kneeling over a soldier with a badly infected foot. Tamara held up a flickering kerosene lamp. I pulled the boot and sock off. The doctor went to work.